come to the 8th presentation of Hermetic America Future. And the cover of the DVDs will be a photograph taken of myself and a statue of Benjamin Franklin here in the Los Angeles area, with rainbow infinity signs over our heads, which is the symbol that I've used for a great many years now for my work. Benjamin Franklin founds a very particular confluence of collected wisdoms. His lifelong occupation was that of printer, and we've talked about how setting type by hand, letter by letter, space by space to make the words, the compositions of the paragraphs, the composition of the page so that it can be printed, inked, and so forth, is a meticulous way to read. And Franklin, being an industrious young man, printed almost everything that came into the confluence of Philadelphia in the Pennsylvania of the 1700s. He printed in English and in German, occasionally in other languages. But he also read and digested, literally letter by letter, word by word, all of this material. And we brought in the previous series, Hermetic America, a 600 or 700 page volume published by the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, which Franklin founded, giving the list of all of the printing jobs of Benjamin Franklin. That particular area of early colonial America was settled by numerous groups fleeing for freedom from an old world that had become constrictive to them, not only in terms of their religious freedom, but their political freedom and their personal freedom. And this confluence of different groups all brought their material to Franklin to be printed, to be issued. And in addition, Franklin also issued the money. He issued all of the printing jobs that came in so that he had a full sphere of personal acquaintance, literally letter by letter, word by word, of the society of the day. And he would be what we would term in 21st century technology a living internet server. And so he empowered other young men in various colonies to set up printing presses and houses. And eventually he had a correspondence with young men in all 13 of the colonies. And because he supplied the paper, he supplied the ink, the know-how, he supplied the annual almanac, Poor Richard's Almanac. He also was appointed postmaster of the colonies, and so the old postal road was the first interstate highway of the United States, and he was the commander-in-chief of understanding how to utilize this everywhere. And Franklin sets up the beginnings of Hermetic America. The most important quality of these origins is summed up in 1836 by Ralph Waldo Emerson in his introduction to his book, his little book, Nature, which has become a world classic. He writes just a few sentences. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. In 1836, this was the best prismatic quality of Hermetic America, Emerson was able to look back through the eyes of the previous generations, and by his time in 1836, Franklin born in 1806, there were about 130 years to look back through. But in looking back through their eyes, they were able to see that the once wilderness that was there was now rapidly becoming the United States, becoming a domesticated landscape. And this was a cause for taking a survey of where it was that they were, and especially of surveying the land that still was untamed, as well as the land that had been tamed, as well as the quality and character of the American experience of humanity. And all of this came to a complete denouement in the 1880s. The 1880s are known as the age of the robber barons, the carpetbaggers, the first big continental industrial concerns, continental railroads, the making of holding companies that had many hundreds of companies within them, the buying of political offices by bribery. Mark Twain called it in one of his great books, The Gilded Age. The most beautiful poem of that particular era was written by Walt Whitman in 1888, 1889, right at the cusp of the year. And it celebrated the making of a statue of one of the greatest American Indian orators in a park. And it was in a park in Buffalo, New York, and the Indian orator was named Red Jacket. And Whitman, who, as we talked about last week, had been in Washington, D.C. during the Civil War. He was a newspaper reporter from New York, the Brooklyn Eagle, but he also was, as a human being, very, very compassionate. And one of his jobs was to go to all of the hospitals where the maimed and wounded, of which there were thousands, both Confederates and Yankees, and Whitman would sit by their bedsides, talk with them, write letters home for them, hold their hand, be with them, north and south, be with the American youth who were just grinding each other up. More than 1 million young men died in the Civil War. It was horrendous. But one of the jobs that Whitman had as well, he was in the newly found Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he was the young man who received the deputations from all the American Indian tribes that Lincoln had invited them to bring to Washington, that the United States would be kept whole. And part of the keeping of it whole, because Lincoln was born in Kentucky when it was just a frontier place, lived in Indiana when it was a frontier place, and moved to Illinois when it was a frontier place. And when Lincoln was 21, he built a log cabin for his parents. And that log cabin in Illinois was built about 20 miles from where my ancestors settled when Illinois was still an Indian territory a couple of hundred years ago. And so I grew up as a youngster having a great aunt like my great aunt Meta Weir, who lived to be 104, who had seen Lincoln when she was a girl and chided my father because he had not taken me around. She said, "We are all Lincoln people here. We belong to a particular kind of America. The wilderness is our friend and our home, and we come from that and are able to carry that with us wherever we go." And that quality of Lincoln inviting the American Indians to send their deputations, remembering that Jefferson had already done this during his administrations of 1800 and 1804, and that Jefferson was interested in American Indian languages and wanted to have grammars made and vocabularies made. And he was planning, after his retirement from the presidency, to study American Indian languages, and the trunk full of these from his two administrations was lost on the way down to Monticello in a torrential stream flooding, and all of it was lost. The American Indian deputations came to the young Whitman. He was the one that registered, and he was the one who understood that the oratorical language of the American Indians was not a rhetoric learned in the Old World, but was a natural poetic of the New World, which young Americans who were experiencing the reality of the New World in new ways was able to begin to understand. And Whitman's great poetry in Leaves of Grass is one of those beautiful exemplars of the chant of a white Indian of the New World singing a Hermetic America to the future. When he turned 70, he suffered from an advanced aging disease. He lived in Camden, New Jersey, on Mickle Street, right across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. That area is spanned now by the Walt Whitman Bridge. The other big bridge is the Benjamin Franklin Bridge, going from Philadelphia into New Jersey. From the doorstep stoop of Whitman's house, you could look across the Delaware and you could see where Franklin had lived, where the American Philosophical Society was, where the University of Pennsylvania was, where the Independence Hall was. And so there was a direct visual link of Whitman and the heritage of Walt Whitman with the heritage with Benjamin Franklin. And so he put out a volume of poems, Sands at 70, and this poem, Red Jacket from Aloft, about the unveiling of the statue of Red Jacket and what it looked like in 1888, 1889, with all of the puffed up, self-important little bureaucrats who were there for the unveiling. Upon this scene, this show, yielded today by fashion, learning, wealth, nor in caprice alone some grains of deepest meaning. Haply aloft, who knows, from distant sky clouds blended shapes, as some old tree or rock or cliff thrilled with its soul, product of nature's sun, stars, earth direct, a towering human form, in hunting shirt of film, armed with a rifle, a half-ironical smile curving its phantom lips, like one of Ossian's ghosts looks down. The way in which America was wasted is undercut and overviewed by an esoteric America that is Hermetic America. an underground stream, and a celestial jet stream over what increasingly was a desecration of the lands. One of the peculiar things in writing of those early days, James Fenimore Cooper, in writing his great leather stocking saga, starting with the Deerslayer in 1840 and going through the Pathfinder, going through the Last of the Mohicans, going through the Pioneers, going through the Prairie, followed the protagonist, who alternately was called Natty Bumppo, was called Hawkeye, was called Pathfinder, was finally nameless as an old man in his 80s out on the prairies. One of the qualities is James Fenimore Cooper's landscapes. Now, Mark Twain made fun of Cooper's landscapes, saying that for dramatic writing, Cooper could always be counted upon, that when you had to be really quiet and the red shirts were ready, or the redskins were ready to butcher you, somebody would step on a twig and it would be like a firecracker through the forest, and you would be revealed and you would be on the run again. And that Cooper specialized in this kind of chase scene that came to characterize dramatic television and now drama everywhere in the world. Films without enough explosions following Cooper's melodrama. What is interesting is that Cooper's father, William Cooper, who founded Cooperstown in northern New York State, where the Baseball Hall of Fame is, wrote a book. And in the book, this is Cooper's book is called A Guide to the Wilderness. William Cooper described the original wilderness, not the results of prodigal land use, but as the waste of creation, that the wilderness was a waste of creation, and that the reclaiming of which was now the first among Americans. So it's good to bulldoze, it's good to cut the forest, plow the land, develop the land with rows of houses, etc. And contrary to that, James Fenimore Cooper saw the wilderness in terms that later on Thoreau would describe in Wilderness as the Preservation of the World. That the deepest nature of man is a pivot of solitude in the ecology of the natural cycle that is open to our participation. And our participation in such a way that we add further dimensions to what space and time are in their four dimensions. And the first dimension that we add is a consciousness of a field of vision that is characteristic. Here is a little bit of the interesting description of Cooper from the Pioneers. The house stood at some distance from the village, in the center of a field surrounded by stumps that were peering above the snow, bearing caps of pure white, nearly 2 feet in thickness. Not a tree or shrub was nigh it, but the house externally exhibited that cheerless, unfinished aspect which is so common to the hastily erected dwellings of a new country. The uninviting character of its outside was, however, happily contrasted by this exquisite neatness and comfortable warmth within. And the writer goes on to point out that this isolated, inner, clean, we used to say in the 50s, a Lysol clean home. No germs allowed, no dirt allowed. But it was a picture of alienation from the land, of alienation from each other, and that what came out of that was a fundamental individualism that had no interface with each other than a concourse of laws and codes and institutional memberships, identifications by gender, by race, by background, by family, by income, and that these granulated individuals thought themselves constituting America, whereas Hermetic America is rather distinctly different from that in every regard, because the Hermetic American realized themselves not as ground-up individuals alienated from the landscape, but as persons who had emerged out of a quintessential visionary time-space that not only was able to look into the past in fresh ways, a new past, continuously, refreshing the past with new facets of understanding, but able to also transparently look through to the future. And so it was the future and the new past, as I say, that characterized a flexible, prismatic presence, rather than a present moment, which was a pointillistic point that separated the past is now dead, the future will be what we organize in terms of our institutions, our plans, our little confabs, our big confabs, and that we will make the kind of future that our plans will make. And of course, this is extremely naive. Many of the American immigrants that came in from the old world found themselves continuously waking up to the land in new ways. And one of the most important was the great sociologist Thorstein Veblen. Veblen was Norwegian. He was from a broken family. They moved several times from the East Coast into the American Midwest, into Wisconsin, into Minnesota. And Veblen grew up to be one of the greatest sociologists of all time. And the great book on Veblen was written by David Reisman, who was at Harvard for many years, whose book, The Lonely Crowd, and others became harbingers of understanding that there is a different America from the individualistic, over-planned groups, that there was a critiquable understanding of human centrality as prismatic pivots that set them in an ecology of the land which was expandable in terms of recalibrating what the land was. And this became in the 1920s because of Veblen and a number of other writers from the American Midwest. The most famous of them was Frederick Jackson Turner. Turner wrote a monumental book in the 1920s, The Frontier in American History. And because of that, he was invited to become a professor at Harvard, but he turned it down and became instead the director of the Huntington here in San Marino, suburb of Pasadena, suburb of Los Angeles. And there at the Huntington, Frederick Jackson Turner wrote a recalibration of the way in which the frontier is a perennial challenge for the best qualities of Americans to come out of the pit traps of a false individuality, to come out of the imprisoning false or faux organizations or plans or institutions that would corral them, that would make them stale, and that it was constantly the response to the challenge of the frontier that characterized Americans. And in that, the first great continental scale expedition was Lewis and Clark. In 1806, Jefferson sent them out to explore all of the continent to the Pacific Ocean, starting in St. Louis and going up the Mississippi River, going up the tributary of the Missouri River to its headwaters in the Rocky Mountains, Glacier National Park, in between Montana and Idaho and Alberta and British Columbia, and going all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Their expedition was a revelation of the wilderness as being populated by incredible tribes, American Indian tribes. And just for the 200th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark expedition, in 2006, Lewis and Clark through Indian eyes. Alvin M. Josephy Jr. Was one of the great American historians of the West, someone raised on Frederick Jackson Turner, on James Fenimore Cooper, on another man that we will talk about and have talked about, John Wesley Powell and his expedition, which we'll talk about next. This is a selection of living members in 2005-06 of all the Indian tribes that were visited by Lewis and Clark and how they looked at them. This is just a few sentences from the last, The Voices of Encounter. I am Lightning Crow of the Arikara. What sort of people would do this? Lewis and Clark and their expedition. What sort of people are doing this? We watched them day by day as they moved against the winds and rains, the mountains and the rocks. They were few, and they seemed very small against the great land and the great sky. But they moved on, and we watched them. They must have had good medicine, and they must have been looking for more, the best and most powerful of medicines. Yes, it must be so. And this we could understand, for we too move against hunger and hardship to secure our medicine. We quest after visions. I believe that these strangers were on a vision quest. This is a quality that by the time of the 1830s was beginning to have a gelling, where you had Emerson's Nature coming out in 1836. But as we talked about, Emerson had originally been a Boston Brahmin of a very highly respected ministerial family. And he was raised to take over the pulpit of one of the biggest churches in Boston, the Second Church of Boston. And he did. And he was a brilliant sermonist. All his life, Emerson could speak eloquently. And then increasingly, he came to understand that there were mysteries. And one of the worst mysteries that can happen to a man happened to him. His beautiful young wife died. And Emerson found that he could not keep stuffing himself into the pulpit of the traditional family church, and finally came to understand that religion is not in the churches. The churches are a part of where religion locates itself, but that outside the church, outside the points of the church, is the true landscape of the divine. And so he began to open himself up here in nature, saying, to go into solitude, a man needs to retire as much from his chamber as from society. I am not solitary whilst I read and write, and nobody is with me. But if a man would be alone, let him look at the stars. Because the stars have always been a hermetic quality of the true expansiveness. The land of the United States was suddenly revealed through Indian eyes in the publication in 1840 by a book by a man named William Pigeon. It was called The Teachings and Remembrances of Werukunyaka Dekuda, a shaman, the Fox Indians in Wisconsin, who showed Pigeon that the landscape of America, of a Hermetic America, of an original America, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, was covered by Indian mounds of all kinds. There were effigy mounds of like animals. There were geometric mounds. Many of them look remarkably like crop circles. Many of them look remarkably like esoteric diagrams and geometries from sacred initiation, which is exactly what they were. And that these diagrams, these mounds, were shown again and again in 1840 in the Memories of Dekuda, that this was indeed, here's the cover of the book, that there is a grandeur to Indian America that those who have come there and undergone the transformation of their field of vision, expanded so that the frontier was like a wavefront energy threshold moving through a landscape which is seamlessly all the way to the stars. That this is a different quality of prismatic person from the caged individualist, the bureaucrat, the politician, the robber baron, and that this was a quality that needed to be explored, especially after the terrible Civil War, punctuated, as it were, by one of the greatest tragedies of American history, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And one of the Civil War captains, John Wesley Powell, as we have talked about, organized an expedition. He had no difficulty being a leader of the expedition, except that he lost an arm in the Civil War, so they had only one arm. And Captain Powell organized 9 other men, and they explored the Green and what became the Colorado River. What Lewis and Clark had not explored, they went north and west. Powell went to the south and the west. And it was the first time that anyone had ever gone through the Grand Canyon. None of the Indian tribes had ever been able to traverse the Colorado River. So this was the first time in human occupation, in human enjoyment of North America. Out of the 10 men, only 6 men made it. All of this was the beginnings, at the time, of the development of a new scale of appreciation of Indian America. The Bureau of American Indian Ethnology was set up with Powell as the first director, and it was Powell who issued in 1879 the first annual big green volumes. I brought one last week. And that first volume, an annual published every year then by the United States Congress, sometimes 700, 800 pages thick. The first volume was all about American Indian languages. And later on, there would be bulletins of the Bureau of Ethnology to complement the annuals. And one of the largest bulletins was a big 2-volume, I'll bring it next week, a study of American Indian languages, canvassing in about 1,500 pages the enormous variety and spread, and making the case for the first time that the native American Indians had to have been here a very long time to have this linguistic diversity. We know now that they have been here for longer than 20,000 years. But those 2 big volumes so impressed the European language philologists that they began to set up a resonance with this kind of original Hermetic America, and out of that was born the science of linguistics. And one of the greatest linguists in Europe came finally, Roman Jacobson, came to America and was set up as a great professor, and one of the young Hermetic Americans who learned from Jacobson's great language genius. He came from St. Petersburg, Russia, originally. He knew all the poets there, and he was a character. I will bring in a couple of his collected works. They're in 9 big volumes. One of the young Hermetic Americans who took a cue from him was Noam Chomsky, who wrote one of the all-time great language insight books, Transformational Grammars. That there is a quality to language that when it comes out of a completed cycling of nature that does not go round and round in some dead rote, but rather jumps and leaps forth, so that the language of experience, while it does integrate into the mind, it is able to go through a transparent symbol array into the field of vision, into the field of consciousness, in that there it re-emerges prismatically rather than just completely integrally. And what you get, I have called this in my work a square of attention, a frame of reference which is not a limiting frame, but is instead a window which is transparent through which one can look. One can look forward to possibilities, and one can also look reflectively at the new possibilities of what has gone before. And the quality of a present expands its frontier shape. And instead of becoming a present moment, it becomes a presence that flows. Let's take a little break. We're coming back. We're looking at one of several thousands of studies that are interesting, that have come out in the last 30 or 40 years on Hermetic America. Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, Poetry of the Central Consciousness. It is Emily Dickinson, whose short poem I will read to begin the second half. None of her poems were given titles. Strong draughts of the refreshing minds to drink enables mine through desert or the wilderness, as it bore its sealed wine, to go elastic or as one. The camel's trait attained, how powerful the stimulus of a Hermetic mind. Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman are the masculine and feminine at the same time of an emergent American poetic. The prose of Hermetic America was always refined, from Benjamin Franklin through Emerson and on, but it was the beginnings of Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson that a new quality of the Hermetic America poetic of the English language began to transform it. While Whitman used an American Indian chant, the stepping of the American Indian ritual, to replace the old world tropes of poetry as quatrains, as verses, as little couplets, as sonnets, to recalibrate that as an ongoing flow, a chant, as in Whitman's Leaves of Grass, one sees in just the first few extended line flows, the stream of Song of the Open Road. A foot and light-hearted I take to the open road. Healthy, free, the world before me, the long brown path before me leading wherever I choose. Henceforth I ask not good fortune. I am myself good fortune. Henceforth I whimper no more, postpone no more, need nothing. Done with indoor complaints, libraries, querulous criticisms, strong and content, I travel the open road. This is an open road of a Lewis and Clark expedition into the further frontiers, the landscape of a prismatic American person who is now able to travel wherever it is in the world freely. Not simply to be a special envoy, as in Indian America, the 5 civilized tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy would have a wampum belt of quill and bead work that if you held the wampum belt over your arm, you were given safe passage anywhere in the 5 tribes. Guaranteed by the sachem of all 5 tribes, so that that confederation was one of the models of the origins of the United States. The wampum belt first given to a European white man was to William Penn. And at one time, that wampum belt, white beads with a blue design of a man standing, was in the possession of Manly Hall at the Philosophic Research Society here in Los Angeles, where I taught for 12 years. And I would, from time to time, take out the artifacts from Indian America that had been collected by Manly Hall. And William Penn's wampum belt was one of the prizes. Also, a red sandstone calumet, a peace pipe. And that all of the peace pipes, all of the red sandstone come from a place where Pipestone, it's called Pipestone, Minnesota, right on the border near North Dakota. And all of the peace pipes in Indian America came from that same spot, that same place. And it's interesting because when Lewis and Clark went on their expedition in that area of the Louisiana Purchase, of the new continental America. One of the tribes that they ran across in the Dakotas, in North Dakota, were the Mandan Indians, who had blue eyes, who had been apparently descendants of ancient explorers to North America, who got as far as Minnesota, got as far as North Dakota. And these would have been, of course, the Vikings at the time of Leif Erikson, about 1000 AD, which should not surprise us, because by 300 BC, an explorer under the ecumenical visionary aegis of Alexander the Great, his name was Pythera, traveled all the way through the Mediterranean Sea, out through the Straits of Gibraltar, up along the coast of Europe, all the way to Britain, and circumnavigated Britain 309 BC, and went as far as the land of the midnight sun, which was Iceland. That was 300 BC, 2,300 years ago. The Vikings periodically went as far as Iceland and Greenland easily by the years before 1000. And so it's no wonder that they were able to visit Vineland, which is New England, and go up the Great St. Lawrence River and go through the Great Lakes all the way to the end of Lake Superior and find themselves in what is today Minnesota. It's interesting that a Hermetic American, an old Viking inheritor like the family of Thorsten Veblen, would end up there in the 19th century. And that one of the first study groups from my learning civilization work was developed and still is running in Minneapolis, Minnesota. One of the qualities here of Whitman is his expansiveness, which complements the quality of Emily Dickinson, that she stayed pivoted in Amherst, Massachusetts. She was a spry, interesting young woman. Her grandfather founded Amherst University in Amherst. Her ancestors came to the United States in 1630. And instead of staying on the New England coast where everything was safe, they were part of the earliest pioneers that went inland in the 1600s and learned to live with the land. And so Amherst became one of those American outpost communities on the Connecticut River, which separates Massachusetts into two halves. And there on the Connecticut River, Amherst, with its school, its university, eventually her grandfather, who was the treasurer for 40 years of the university, would pass that on to his only son, Austin Dickinson. Emily had a sister, Lavinia. But one time visiting Washington, D.C., where her grandfather was a congressional figure there. She was coming back through the New York area, and she fell in love with a gem of a man. The difficulty was he was already married. He was a judge. He was a poet as well. He was an extraordinary man. And they immediately had this incredible infinity, yet he was already married. And in those days, this is the 1850s, you did not divorce. It was not a light thing. She went more and more from then on to stay in Amherst. And as she did, and her visionary frontier opened wider and wider into an infinity, her curtailing of her movements was like a signal that she had retired from a world that she could not participate in because of the conventions. She went to wearing white dresses, like an elegant woman of the house, but as also a ghostly nun from this world into the expansiveness of the spirit. Poetry for her then became a language of the spirit that evanesces from this world into the dimensions where time and space freely flow into the ecology of the differential conscious vision, the artistic prismatic person, the flow of spiritual kaleidoscopic history, and on into the cosmic infinities that are available. She writes 2 little short poems. I reckon when I count it all, first poets, then the sun, then summer, then the heaven of God. And then the list is done. But looking back, the first so seems to comprehend the whole. The others look like a needless show, so I write poets. All. This summer lasts a solid year. They can afford a sun. The east would seem extravagant, and if the final heaven be beautiful, as they disclose to those who trust in them, it is too difficult a grace to justify the dream. This was a poet. It is that distills amazing sense from ordinary meanings. And attars so immense from the familiar species that perished by the door, we wonder it was not ourselves arrested it before. Of pictures, the discloser, the poet, it is he entitles us by contrast to ceaseless poverty. Of portions so unconscious the robbing could not harm, himself to him, a fortune exterior to time. What is interesting about Hermetic America is that it sometimes takes a delayed response because there is no reaction. It takes a characteristic delayed response before an appreciation begins to set in. There were only a handful of her poems published in a newspaper in her lifetime. It wasn't until 1911 that her sister Lavinia published a little volume of her poems. But it wasn't until 1924 that a descendant published the poems of Emily Dickinson, Martha Dickinson Bianchi, and the sepia photograph of Emily Dickinson in her white lace dress, the only portrait ever taken of her. These poems were suddenly published in 1924 because 4 months before then, the Life and Letters of Emily Dickinson were published. And all of a sudden, within about a 6-month period in 1924, it was astounding, the world response to the incredible genius of Emily Dickinson. The unpublished poems appeared 50 years after Emily Dickinson's death. They were but further proof that she is of the immortals, according to Percy Hutchinson in the New York Times Book Review. In this libation, there are no dregs, no single drop can be spared. To is the conclusion of William McCarthy of the Yale Review, while the American Mercury, Louis Untermeyer, a great editor of poetry, asserts that the reader can only be grateful for more of the audacious images and dazzling communications which make Emily Dickinson, with the possible exception of Sappho, the greatest woman poet of all time. And exactly in that lull between her death, she died at age 56 in 1886, and the publication in 1924, it was in that time period that one of the great Hermetic American female poets rose and published, and her name was Amy Lowell, and in the American Hermetic America series before this, I talked extensively about Amy Lowell. Amy Lowell's family from Lowell, Massachusetts, they founded it. Her brother Percival was the one who pursued astronomy to prove that there were canals on Mars, and who founded his observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, where the Lowell Observatory is still there today, doing all kinds of work on Mars Hill. But Amy Lowell took the spiritual essence of Emily Dickinson and developed a poetic theoria, a contemplative theory of poetry which was based on the image, and it's called imagism, or those poets who practiced it, the imagists. And these imagists, the American poet who tried to take over Amy Lowell's pioneering was Ezra Pound, and say, well, I'm the original imagist. The original imagist is Emily Dickinson. One of the qualities that was teased out of the quintessence of Emily Dickinson's poetic is characteristic of the Hermetic tradition, that one receives a heritage which is fertile, that it can be further developed. And one of the qualities is that you bring your presence into the shared presence of the previous Hermetic personages, which can be done so because they are not individuals. They are not limited by the present in a confined space. They are available in multidimensional qualities of a spectrum of possibilities. And one of the earliest signals of this kind of capacity is in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, that after the great flood, and Noah and his family and his pairs of saved animals and plants are brought back to a new earth, a new land, a new landscape. The covenant between Noah and God is the rainbow set in the sky. And that rainbow covenant is the first indication that one has of the spectrum of possibilities as a set, as a calibrated set of all the colors that there are. And the origin of writing it that way was Moses, who was raised in Egypt. And Moses was raised in Egypt 400 years after a time when there was a great wise man who was Jewish, who saved Egypt. And his name was Joseph. And Joseph was the son of Jacob. Jacob was the grandson of Abraham. So Abraham was the great-grandfather of Joseph. And Joseph's distinctive quality of being able to interpret dreams, of being able to critique and understand visions, was marked by his father Jacob, who gave him a coat of many colors, gave him a rainbow coat. And it is the ancient tradition of that rainbow coat that goes all the way through in later millennia and becomes the coat that the Druidic Celtic bards wore as a poet. In our time, the last great magus poet to wear the coat of many colors was W.B. Yeats. His closest friend, George Russell, took the initials A.E. because of the first letters of the word aeon, A-E-O-N. The Greek spelling is A-I-O-N. They were that generation that still understood the transform hermetic of a prismatic poetic able to generate the full spectrum of a possibility of a person that goes out into the cosmos. And of course, Yeats was one of the founders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The quality of Hermetic America about this time, about the time of Yeats and A.E., coming as an inheritor of Whitman and of especially Emily Dickinson. Amy Lowell, this is just an example from one of her collections of poems published in 1917, Men, Women, and Ghosts. Just a few imagist lines about little girls playing in the garden of a home where they have been allowed to play free. A checkered table of blacks and grays, oblong blocks of flatness, crawl by with low-geared engines and pass to short, upright squares, shrinking with distance. A steamer in the basin blows its whistle, and the sound shoots across the rain hatchings, a narrow, level bar of steel. Hard cubes of lemon superimpose themselves upon the fronts of buildings. It is a quality where each word in the line is set in such a way that you find the line itself has given you an image. And the next line, instead of being an emendation, as in verse, of the previous line, is another image. So that what you begin to have is a series of images that when you begin to hear by reading aloud the poem, the hearing carries the series into a transform, so that instead of a series in a set, you have what is called in mathematics now a cascade. And the cascade is kept flowing by an algorithmic insight that is carried along continuously. That cascade continues as long as the gestalt of the image set continues to morph its shape in the hearing of the hearers, in the reading of the readers. And Amy Lowell is one of the all-time great geniuses in poetry because she intuited that one of the great poetic heritages of the world that had not ever been sufficiently appreciated in English was Chinese. And so she got together with a friend of hers, Florence Askow, in Boston, and they decided to investigate, since Florence could read Chinese. Boston had a lot of trade with the Far East. The shipping magnates of Boston went all over the world. Melville, in his Moby Dick, says that Nantucket ships owned the seas, and New Bedford men sailed those ships, and they were at home the world round, and everyone knew they were the best sailors that had ever lived. They went freely wherever. And Boston was the recipient of all of these kinds of contacts and things, and Florence Ascow could read Chinese because of her family. And with Amy Lowell, they made a translation called Fir Flower Tablets by taking the Chinese characters and having each word be like a building up of an image, that the line in Chinese poetry is often a series of limited characters. The all-time great Chinese poet that they took was Tu Fu. And Tu Fu's poetic line is 5 characters arranged in 8 lines, so that the classic Tu Fu Tang Dynasty poem is 40 characters. And they would make images out of each line and then put them into the cascade of the language, and the translations that they made of Chinese poetry, especially of Tu Fu, became the classic example of how Hermetic Americans began to understand the great traditions of the world in their poetic, and Americans began to transform the way in which they were able to write. And one of the great poets, Hermetic Americans, is Wallace Stevens, who came from Hartford, Connecticut, in that region of New England, down the Connecticut River from Emily Dickinson, not too far from the Massachusetts of Amy Lowell, and very close to New York City of Walt Whitman. Wallace Stevens became, in his profession, the vice president of the Hartford Accident Insurance Company. But on his commute to go into work each day, he would compose a poem in his poetic imagination. And the first order of business for his executive secretary was to take down the poem of the morning. Here's one of the earliest poems of the morning of the vice president of Hartford Accident Insurance Company. It's called The Snowman. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time, to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place. For the listener who listens in the snow, and nothing himself beholds, nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. It's American Zen. This quality of the land, of the landscape, appealing to Hermetic Americans, came to a real jump in 1910, the founding of the great 100-inch telescope at Mount Wilson just above Los Angeles. You see, Los Angeles plays, like Chicago, as important a part as Philadelphia, New York, or Boston in Hermetic America. This is a photograph of Andrew Carnegie, who put up a lot of the money for it, of George Ellery Hale, who founded the project, and right in the middle is John Muir, here with the long beard. And it is John Muir who begins to take the cue from the Lewis and Clark expedition, from the expedition along the Colorado of John Wesley Powell, but John Muir makes it in the center like an arrow and goes all the way and finds that the great poetic mountain range on the other side of the Rockies is the Sierra Nevada, and he's the one who discovers the twin great park canyons, Yosemite and its twin, Hetch Hetchy, which unfortunately a dam was built and it was drowned. It's now just a lake, a reservoir. It was the twin of Yosemite. It is there in Yosemite that John Muir discovered the magic of the Spirit being able to come into as a presence the impossibility of what time and space had limited, and to open it up to unlimited possibilities. He was at the top of El Capitan, viewing the sunset, and wanted to get down a little bit further from the top to get more comfortable. And watching the grandeur of the sunset, it suddenly occurred to him, because of the cool air drafts coming up as they do in the Sierras in the summertime, that it was getting dark very quickly and he had to climb to the top. He suddenly realized that he was pretty far from the top, that he could hardly see, and that the altitude was beginning to wither his muscular reserves. And he got to a part where he had to cling above him, and his feet lost their footing. And he hung there, his fingers tiring. And he thought that he had bought it. So he relaxed in his spirit. And suddenly, without effort, he was able to pull himself up and gain the top of El Capitan. And he turned and gave a deep bow to the setting sun and the night tilting in the air, and realized that there are men to match the mountains, and that there is a spirit there. And it is that planetary vision that is now published in publications like the Planetary Report, published in Pasadena, right off the Caltech campus, in between, just south of the JPL, in view of Mount Wilson, not far from the Huntington, founded by Carl Sagan, and we'll talk about Sagan and his family next week further. But the Planetary Report is also echoed by something like Icarus, an American publication, which is the International Journal of Solar System Studies. One is viewing the Earth as a planet. The other is viewing the planet in a star system. This is volume 196, July 2008. The quality of Hermetic America expands even beyond Planetary Report, Icarus, Solar System Studies, beyond the Hubble telescope, beyond even the projected coming James Webb Space Telescope. And in May of 2008, Microsoft Worldwide Telescope blasts off by taking images. This is really imagist poetic. Images from the Hubble Space Telescope, the Chandra X-ray Observatory, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, the Spitzer Telescope, and putting them all together on the web so that someone would be able to access in their own home, where they live, where they sit to compose their communication with other interfaces of persons. And in August, just a few months later, the Daily Galaxy News from Planet Earth and Beyond, the LSST, the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, which will be up and running on the World Web in 2014, which will allow someone to utilize one of the largest telescopes in the world, an 8.4 meter, to look at whatever celestial phenomena you would like to program and have access to instantly. The frontier now extends in its rainbow covenant into an infinity of colors. We can wear this cloak by re-inhabiting the heritage which is present in a cascade for us and extend it into the future. The American publication in 1911 of Ralph 124C41 by Hugo Gernsback. And Hugo Gernsback used the acclaim from this novel, which was published in a serial 1911-1912, to found the Amazing Stories, the first science fiction magazine, in 1926. So influential was Ralph 124C41, set at 2660 in the future, that this special edition was published as a reprint by the University of Nebraska Press in Lincoln. Bison Books has taken the cream of American and British visionary science fiction and reissued them. There are now several dozen in the set, so that one begins to see that the future is beginning with the moon and extending through the star system out into the interstellar frontier, at the same time that research is going out into the cosmic frontier. By 2014, we will have new horizons, exploratory satellite reaching all the way out to Pluto and Charon. At the same time that online will be Messenger and Mercury. And so in a parenthesis, the entire star system for the first time will come under the ken of the expansive differential consciousness of kaleidoscopic history. And right at the pivot in the middle, exactly at that time, the Dawn satellite will reach Ceres in the asteroid belt, which is a pivot in between Pluto and Mercury. And we will have at that time, by about 2015, for the very first time, an actual technological, conscious appraisal in science, in art, in visionary consciousness, in kaleidoscopic history of what will become a stellar civilization, our home on the interstellar frontier. Next week we will talk about the way in which alien contacts, the development of our own Hermetic America sequence, giving us a very interesting kind of interface that is coming up in about 7 years, where we will at last take a very honored place in a cosmos that largely is not a threat to us, but like a wilderness is a new landscape of capacity. More next week.